Thank you for talking to me today, Ellie,
Thank
about
you.
your paper, Phenomenology and the Ethics of Love. Um, and in this paper, you deal with you start with the history of phenomenology and love, and some of the central distinctions that you are talking about are, for instance, true and false love, and the distinction between valuing a person and valuing a relationship. So could you maybe to get us started a little bit, elaborate on these distinctions? So what is the distinction between true and false love in the phenomenological way, and what is the difference between valuing a person and valuing a relationship?
Yeah, thank you. So I would say that, and I'll just start by saying in this article, I'm trying to draw general broad strokes of a phenomenological view of love. Of course, there are different traditions within phenomenology and different disagreements that are quite productive, including on the nature of love. But I also think there's something to be said for giving as general as possible an account as we can. And so in this article, I'm focusing on things that I think that, generally speaking, most phenomenologists would assent to in different ways. The distinction between true and false love is one that you see in a variety of different phenomenologists, including from the beginnings of phenomenology in the early 20th century. And this distinction usually has to do with whether you are actually recognizing the other person, the loved one, as a subject, consciousness, and or freedom. A way that we might put this outside of the phenomenological context is in Kantian terms, where Immanuel Kant makes the distinction between treating somebody as a means and treating somebody as an end. I think there's a similar thing going on in the phenomenological distinction between true and false love. In false love, you are treating the other person as an ideal image rather than as an actual person unto themselves. And so the love that you are giving towards them is really dependent on objectifying them. And that might not look like objectification the way that we usually think about it, as like, say, sexual objectification or just treating somebody as a thing. But the bottom line is that it's really not going to be providing a feedback loop where the other person can actually challenge your own self-conception and show up to you as a complex subjectivity with their own desires, intentions, and will. And related to that also is this idea that in false love, when you feel loved by the other person, that is also perhaps a projection or a refraction from how you are perceiving them through this idealized image. True love, in contrast, is going to involve that recognition. And I know it sounds kind of vague to say a recognition of a subjectivity or a consciousness or a freedom. Those are different words that different phenomenologists use. But that recognition really involves seeing the other person as having a perspective on you. So you might think about Sartre's notion of the look. Jean-Paul Sartre has this idea that when we look at other people, sure, we are relating to them in a certain way, but it's actually when they look at us, when we feel ourselves to be the object of their gaze, that a true recognition of the other gets off the ground. And that recognition of the other as subject who is looking at me is really important. Sartre's view has sometimes been critiqued for focusing too much on vision. But you see this in various ways with other phenomenologists as well. In Simone de Beauvoir and Merleau-Ponty's work, for instance, there's an emphasis on touch. Beauvoir talks about the erotic encounter, which involves erotic touch, as including a sense of myself as both subject and object for the other, and a sense that the other is an object for me and also a subject for themselves. And so true love, which we could also call authentic love, is going to involve that reciprocity. True and authentic aren't always synonyms in the phenomenological tradition, nor are false and inauthentic always synonyms in the phenomenological tradition either. For instance, people like Heidegger will want to distinguish authenticity from truth. But I think when we're talking in this sense, we can, broadly speaking, say that true and authentic love are synonymous and inauthentic and false love are synonymous. Oh, and then the value of the loved one versus the relationship was the other thing that you asked about.
Yeah. Would you like to respond to that, or I could ask a question also? Just
sure. Yeah. Why don't you ask a follow-up, and then I can return to the other distinction that we haven't addressed yet after that.
Yeah. So what you said made a lot of sense to me. But how would you respond to the challenge of somebody saying, okay, so what phenomenology is offering us in terms of love is this reciprocity between being the object of some subject and the other being the object of my subjectivity, in a sense that we can only ever be sort of objectivating ourselves reciprocally and sort of create this perspective indifference, as you call it. But, you know, more traditionally, one would assume that a concept of love or a view of love would also somehow try to explain this feeling of oneness and this inseparability, which is not necessarily the reciprocity that you were just sort of mentioning.
Yeah, thanks for that. My view of love is generally opposed to a view that conceives of love as oneness. And I see this same rejection of the idea that love involves an inseparability between self and other as a major contribution of the phenomenological tradition to the theory of love. Pretty much all phenomenologists associate the feeling of oneness with the false love that we mentioned earlier. So earlier I talked about false love as involving an idealized image of the other, but I think a really important corollary to that as well is that when we think about that idealized image, what we actually see is that there is no genuine separation between self and other. And so for many phenomenologists, the experience of oneness is dependent on not actually experiencing the other as other, but rather reducing them to you, reducing them to the same. I think one of the texts that really started my interest in this area is Simone de Beauvoir's novel, She Came to Stay, or L'Invité in French. And in that novel, she describes a ménage à trois between a long-term couple, Pierre and Françoise, who then introduce a third younger woman into their relationship, Xavier. And this is loosely based on an actual experience that Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre had in their lives with a young woman named Olga. And the lesson of the novel, to my mind, is that the introduction of a third party reveals to Françoise that she and Pierre have never actually been one, that there is a fundamental separation between the two of them that she has failed to recognize. And so even though their relationship seemed like quite loving and really wonderful and leaving room open for the freedom of the other, in fact, the introduction of a third party introduces something that Françoise can really not wrap her head around, which is Pierre's desire for another woman. And that inability to wrap her head around this reveals that actually she has not loved him in this genuinely free way. And the novel ends with her still not being able to recognize that. So it is a cautionary tale. Beauvoir also talks about the dangers of false love in her nonfiction works on love as dangers of jealousy and devotion. So jealousy, I think we just saw, that's the example that comes up in L'Invité. But then there's also the problem of devotion, which is devoting yourself so entirely to the other person that you think you're doing everything for them. It's a self-sacrificial attitude, but that self-sacrificial attitude ends up actually being narcissistic because you're not really leaving room for the other as other. You are just sort of smothering them. It's what the contemporary theorist Mari Ruti calls the praying mantis approach. And so I think Beauvoir, even though the Pierre-Françoise relationship is by no means a model of authentic love, right? It's actually, I think, a designation that what appeared to be authentic love is either inauthentic completely or at least like has inauthentic elements. But I think that paves the way for a more authentic conception of love for Beauvoir, which recognizes difference. The perspective in difference is something that I'm drawing in particular from the work of contemporary philosopher Alain Badiou, who is not a phenomenologist, but is influenced by the phenomenological tradition. And he talks about this scene of two, where two lovers are looking out at a landscape together. And as they're looking out at the landscape together, they recognize that they have different perspectives on it. Then you're never actually going to be able to see the landscape through the loved one's eyes, but you are nonetheless seeing it together. So there is a kind of joint perception, but that joint perception still recognizes the difference between self and other. And I think that leads into that other distinction in my article that you asked about earlier, which is the difference between valuing the loved one and valuing the relationship. This is a distinction that was inspired by the work of Nico Kolodny, who's working more in an analytic philosophy of love framework. But I think really phenomenologists attest to the fact that valuing a loved one is in principle distinct from valuing a relationship. This doesn't mean that they don't overlap all the time, but it's one thing to really value the other as other, and it's another to value the relationship that we are creating together. And although those, I think, need to go in tandem in order for there to be love, there are sometimes situations in which tensions emerge between valuing these two things. And that leads to some of the dilemmas, I think, that can come up in loving relationships.
Thank you. So what you say, so this sort of fortuitous disillusionment that happens when we phenomenologically sort of look at the way that we can, or maybe even should, of others. And so this would also go towards saying, so you mentioned the sort of the side effects of this feeling of oneness, that being jealous, being devotional. So I guess you could say, if you approach a traditional sort of love setting and tear the parties apart a little bit, then the inherent inequalities that were sort of implicated in this oneness would come to light all along, in a sense, right? Because oneness for the parties, even though the parties are one, but the oneness means different things to everybody involved, because, as you say, at the end, it's sort of a narcissistic, or at least it's a very inauthentic way of looking at what actually happens. So would you say that the phenomenology is then able to make this, to approach this distinction in the first place between valuing a person and valuing the relationship? Is that something that would be sort of conflated in this other scenario of oneness, and does it only become available as the subject of reflection once we take in the perspective in difference?
Yeah, I would say so. And there may be times when it feels more like we are one than others, but that feeling, as you said, if we set store by that feeling and assume that indicates an ontological or metaphysical oneness, then we are going to be collapsing into inauthentic love.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So in your paper, you also suggest sort of a counter proposal to, or let's say, or a lived way to reflect this phenomenological approach, which you call consensual non-monogamy, I think. And could you elaborate a little more on this counter suggestion that would be more true to what phenomenologists view of authentic love?
Yeah. Beauvoir and Sartre, as is perhaps evident from my saying that L'Invité is based on real life experience, had an open relationship for pretty much the entire duration of their adult lives. And as two prominent phenomenologists, this was part and parcel of their philosophical views of freedom. They thought that monogamy, and especially monogamous marriage, served to denigrate freedom. And Beauvoir, in particular, as is very well known, thought that monogamous marriage tends to encourage inauthentic love among women in particular. It encourages inauthentic love for both parties, but there's a particular effect that it has on women, because women are sort of taught to think that love is their destiny and that they can achieve their freedom through the transcendence or freedom of their male partner, right? And so when she's writing The Second Sex in the late 1940s, things were quite different, obviously, than they are today in terms of gender egalitarianism. But I think the core idea that monogamous marriage tends to denigrate the freedom of parties, and therefore not really live up to the standards of valuing the other person and valuing the relationship, holds true. Now, Beauvoir and Sartre are probably the most well-known phenomenologists who actually practice open relationships. And I don't think that there's much in early phenomenology that is like going to explicitly help us conceptualize non-monogamous marriage, right? It's not like Husserl was talking about open marriages or critiquing marriage. But I do think that the broad strokes of phenomenological approaches to love are not only quite sympathetic with non-monogamous perspectives, but actually may end up counseling non-monogamous perspectives more than monogamous ones. That last bit is something I'm still trying to work through. Is it the case, for instance, even in Beauvoir's philosophy, that monogamous relationships are fundamentally less authentic than non-monogamous ones? I don't know the answer to that, although I have a piece that I have to finish soon that should be answering that. So I'm going to have to figure it out probably in the next month or so. But I do think that at the very least, she thinks that accepting wholesale monogamous norms around marriage does lead to inauthentic love, because dominant monogamous norms counsel jealousy. They really license it in any situation that makes somebody feel like they're not the sovereign one, right? And so Beauvoir begins L'Invité with an epigraph from Hegel, and from Hegel's section on the master-servant dialectic, where he says that each consciousness seeks the death of the other. And in her view, part of the problem of the oneness model of love is that it fails to recognize the otherness of the other consciousness by treating it as something that just needs to be killed, right? Each consciousness seeks the death of the other. So non-monogamous relationships at least have, by encouraging us to question the licensing of jealousy, as well as the licensing of devotion, I think, at least more opportunity for authenticity at an empirical level than, say, monogamous relationships on her view. Which is, of course, not to say that like all non-monogamous relationships are authentic. I would definitely never say that, and I don't think she would say that either. But two, something that was really important for both Beauvoir and Sartre was to craft their own relational norms, not to treat love as needing to follow these scripts that we have been given, but actually something to question. And so I think any kind of relationship can practice that active questioning, can reflect on dominant social scripts and choose to live them out differently, differently than just kind of like walking along in the footsteps of everyone who we know and doing the same thing as they do, right? But authenticity is definitely going to be associated with a conscious reflection on what you are doing when you're entering into a relationship, and whether or not that leads to a non-monogamous situation. I think Beauvoir is critical of monogamous norms that encourage us not to actually reflect on that.
Okay, maybe as a last question, so you also mentioned Badiou and this very intuitive scenario where we share, not sharing the same perspective.
Yeah.
Could this be a good image for the kind of enlightened phenomenological love that you also discuss in this paper?
Yeah, I think so. I really like Badiou's scene of two. I think it's super helpful for thinking about the joint perception or shared life that we craft with others, as well as for reflecting on the otherness that is involved. Now, Badiou's view is the model is a pair bond of a couple I'd have to think more about whether the two-ness is fundamental to that as well or not. Most of my work on non-monogamy has to do with open relationships that involve a primary partnership. But I've been working a lot recently. I just hosted this conference on philosophy of non-monogamies with folks who are more in the space of polyamory, and wondering whether, maybe that two scene could be opened up to a scene of 3 or 4, say. I think I would have to think more about whether that would still be compatible with Badiou's view, or whether there is this fundamental nature of two there. I think there's value for sure to pair bonding, but I also want to be open to other relational configurations. But I like the scene quite a lot for reflecting on that perspective and difference that you mentioned.
Okay, thank you so much, Ellie, for talking to me about your paper. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniel, for the great questions, and I'm really excited to see where this series takes us. Yeah. Let's say I'll be watching along and listening along.
Yeah.